I was walking across the stage at Northwestern University with my master's degree in electrical engineering when I saw my parents get up from their seats and leave. Not quietly, not discreetly. They stood up in the middle of the ceremony, grabbed their coats, and walked out while the dean was still calling names. My mother didn't even look back. 3 rows behind them, my girlfriend Emma watched it happen with her mouth hanging open, and I could see other families turning to stare at the empty seats my parents had just abandoned. After the ceremony, I found them in the parking lot loading their car, and when I asked what was wrong, my father turned to me and said, "We're not proud of you anymore, Kieran. Figure out your own life from here." That was 2 years ago, and I still didn't know why they had thrown me away like garbage until I found the letters hidden in my grandmother's attic that explained everything. My name is Kieran Walsh, and for the past 18 months I've been working as a systems engineer at Quantum Tech Solutions in downtown Chicago. Every morning I take the blue line from my studio apartment in Wicker Park, carrying a laptop bag that weighs more than it should and a travel mug filled with coffee that never stays hot long enough. The office building has those floor-to-ceiling windows that make everything look important, and I have a desk on the 23rd floor where I design security systems for banks and government buildings. Most nights after work, I stop at Murphy's Pub on Division Street, not because I'm much of a drinker, but because the bartender Danny knows my order and doesn't ask questions when I sit there working on freelance projects until closing time. My apartment is small, just 600 square feet, but it's mine. I pay for it with money I earn, and nobody can tell me what to do inside those walls. The furniture is secondhand, but it's clean and functional, and I sleep better there than I ever did in my childhood bedroom. Before my parents cut me off, I thought I understood how families worked. You support each other, you celebrate achievements together, you show up when it matters. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree that took me 6 years of night school to complete while working full-time jobs to pay for it. I thought they would be proud. I thought wrong, but I kept that diploma hanging on my living room wall anyway, because some accomplishments don't need anyone else's approval to matter. If this story makes you think about your own family secrets, make sure you're subscribed. We tell these stories because they need to be told. Growing up in Oak Park, I was the kid who fixed things. When the television remote stopped working, my father would hand it to me instead of buying a new one. When my mother's computer froze, she would call me downstairs to figure out what was wrong. I was good with my hands and good with problems, and my parents seemed happy about that until I decided to make it my career. The first crack appeared when I was 22 and announced I was going back to school for engineering. My father, who managed a small accounting firm, said college was a waste of time for people like us. He said I should be grateful to have a steady job at the electronics repair shop, where I'd been working since high school, and that dreaming about better things was how people ended up disappointed. But I had saved enough money to pay for classes, and I thought if I proved I could do it, he would understand. For years later, when I graduated with my bachelor's degree, they came to the ceremony, but left immediately afterward. No dinner, no celebration, no acknowledgement that I had just accomplished something nobody else in our family had ever done. My mother said congratulations in the parking lot, but it sounded like she was reading it off a card. My father shook my hand and told me not to let success go to my head, whatever that meant. The real problem started when I got accepted into the master's program and received a partial scholarship. Instead of being proud, my father became angry in a way I had never seen before. He said I was showing off, that I thought I was better than the family that raised me. He asked who I thought I was, acting like some kind of genius when I came from working-class people who had never needed fancy degrees to make an honest living. Every conversation became an argument about my choices, my attitude, my ingratitude for everything they had given me. The morning after my graduation disaster, I drove to my parents' house in Oak Park and found them in the kitchen having coffee like nothing had happened. My mother was reading the newspaper and my father was checking his phone. Neither of them acknowledged that they had humiliated me in front of 300 people the day before, or that they had spent 2 years treating me like a stranger. I asked them directly why they hated my success so much, why they couldn't just be happy that their son had made something of himself. My father looked up from his phone and told me that success built on lies wasn't worth celebrating. When I asked what lies he was talking about, my mother folded her newspaper and said I knew exactly what I had done. But I didn't know. I had no idea what they were talking about, what secret crime I was supposed to have committed, what betrayal I was supposed to confess to. For 20 minutes, we went in circles, them acting like I was guilty of something obvious, me genuinely confused about what I was being accused of. Finally, my father stood up and told me that if I wanted to keep pretending I didn't understand, that was my choice, but they were done enabling my selfishness. He said I had always been different from the rest of the family, always acted like I was too good for the life they had given me. He said my education had made me arrogant and ungrateful, and that watching me receive awards and recognition for work I hadn't earned made him sick to his stomach. Then he said something that hit me like a physical blow. He told me that I wasn't the son they thought they had raised, and that maybe it was better if we all stopped pretending otherwise. I left that house feeling like I had been cut loose from everything I thought I understood about myself. For 18 months, I replayed that conversation in my head, trying to figure out what I had missed, what I had done wrong, what secret everyone knew except me. The answer came from an unexpected place. My grandmother had died 3 months earlier, and I was the only one in the family with a flexible enough schedule to help clean out her house before it went on the market. My parents had gone through the main rooms already, taking what they wanted and leaving the rest for donation. They assigned me to the attic, probably because they thought there was nothing up there worth keeping. I spent a Saturday afternoon sorting through boxes of Christmas decorations, old photo albums, and furniture that had been stored away for decades. Most of it was junk, but in a cardboard box labeled important papers, I found something that stopped my heart from beating normally. It was a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon, addressed to my grandmother in handwriting I didn't recognize. The letters were from a lawyer in Detroit, dated from 27 years ago. They were about a wrongful death settlement that had been paid to my grandmother after my grandfather died in an industrial accident. The settlement was for $250,000, more money than my family had ever talked about having. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was what my grandmother had done with the money. According to the lawyer's letters, she had used that settlement to pay for my father's accounting certification, to buy my parents their first house, and to set up college funds for any future grandchildren. The letters mentioned me by name, even though I was only 3 years old when they were written. My grandmother had specifically designated money for my education, money that was supposed to be kept in trust until I was ready for college. Sitting in that dusty attic, holding papers that proved my entire education should have been paid for by inheritance money, I finally understood why my parents had been so angry about my success. They hadn't just failed to support my dreams, they had stolen the money that was meant to make those dreams possible, then made me feel guilty for achieving them anyway. The next few weeks felt like living underwater. I went to work, I came home, I sat in my apartment staring at those letters and trying to decide what to do with information that could destroy my family. The lawyer's correspondence showed that my grandmother had set up the education fund through a small community bank that had been bought out by a larger institution in the early 2000s. There might still be records, but finding them would require more than just asking politely. My first step was calling the law firm that had handled the settlement. The original lawyer had retired, but his partner was still practicing and remembered the case. She told me that wrongful death settlements of that size were usually managed through specific legal instruments, and that if money had been designated for education, there should be paperwork showing how it was distributed. She gave me the name of the bank that had managed the trust account and suggested I might want to hire someone to help me trace the money. I spent $800 I couldn't afford on a forensic accountant who specialized in finding missing assets. It took her 2 weeks to track down the records, but what she found was even worse than I had expected. The education fund had grown to over $40,000 by the time I graduated high school, enough to pay for my entire bachelor's degree and most of my master's program. But in 2016, the year I started college, my father had withdrawn the entire amount by claiming he was using it for my education expenses. The bank records showed that the money had been transferred to my parents' personal checking account, not to any school or education-related expense. My forensic accountant found evidence that the withdrawal had been used to pay off credit card debt, finance a new car, and fund home renovations that my parents had completed the year I started my degree program. They had taken money that was specifically saved for my future and used it to improve their own lives, then watched me struggle to pay for school with jobs and loans and scholarships. The worst part was realizing that they had known all along that I deserved their support, that I had literally inherited the right to an education, and they had chosen to let me believe I was asking for something I didn't deserve. Every time I had felt guilty about pursuing my dreams, every time I had wondered if I was being selfish or ungrateful, they had known I was actually just trying to claim what was already mine. I waited until Thanksgiving to make my move. My parents had been sending me increasingly hostile text messages for weeks, complaining that I hadn't called or visited, acting like I was the one who had damaged our relationship. They expected me to show up at their house Thursday afternoon, eat dinner at their table, and pretend everything was normal. Instead, I showed up with a manila folder full of bank records, legal documents, and a letter from my forensic accountant detailing exactly how much money they had stolen from me. The house was full of relatives I hadn't seen in months: my Aunt Carol and Uncle Pete, my cousin Danny with his new wife, neighbors who had been invited to fill empty chairs. My mother had made her usual spread of turkey and side dishes, and my father was holding court in the living room, telling stories about work and complaining about politics. Everyone seemed happy to see me, like the family drama of the past 2 years had been forgotten or forgiven. I waited until after the meal, when everyone was sitting around the dining room table drinking coffee and picking at leftover dessert. Then I pulled out the folder and placed it on the table in front of my father's coffee cup. I told him I had found some interesting documents while cleaning out grandmother's attic and that I thought the family might want to know what I had discovered. My father opened the folder and his face went completely white. He looked at the first page, a copy of the lawyer's letter detailing the education fund, and then quickly closed the folder and tried to slide it off the table. But I had made copies for everyone, and I started handing them out to my aunt, my uncle, my cousin, and the neighbors who had stayed for coffee. I explained, very calmly and very clearly, that my grandparents had left money specifically for my education, and that my parents had taken that money and used it for their own purposes while making me feel guilty for wanting to go to college. I showed them the bank records proving when the money was withdrawn and how it was spent. I explained that for 6 years, I had worked nights and weekends to pay for a degree that should have been funded by inheritance money that was already mine. The room went completely silent. My Aunt Carol, who had always been the family peacemaker, looked at my father and asked if what I was saying was true. My father started to give some explanation about how they had needed the money for family expenses, how they had planned to pay it back, how I didn't understand how expensive it was to raise a child. But the bank records were right there on the table, showing exactly when the money was taken and exactly what it was used for. My cousin Danny, who worked in banking, picked up the forensic accountant's report and read it out loud. $43,000 withdrawn in 2016. Used to pay credit card debt, finance a vehicle, and fund home improvements. None of it went to education expenses. None of it was ever paid back or replaced. The aftermath was swift and brutal. By Christmas, half the extended family had stopped speaking to my parents. My Aunt Carol, who had co-signed loans to help me pay for school, was particularly angry when she realized she had been helping me pay for an education that should have already been funded. My Uncle Pete, who worked in construction and understood the value of honest work, told everyone at his job about what had happened. In a community where people know each other's business, stealing from your own child's inheritance is the kind of thing that follows you everywhere. My parents' small-town reputation crumbled in a matter of weeks. The accounting firm where my father worked started getting questions from clients who had heard the story and were concerned about trusting their finances to someone who would steal from his own family. My mother, who had worked part-time at the local library for 15 years, suddenly found her hours reduced and her workplace interactions strained. People who had known them for decades began treating them differently, and they couldn't figure out how to explain their way out of documented evidence. The house they had renovated with my inheritance money went on the market in February. They told people they were downsizing, but everyone knew they were being forced to sell because my father's business was falling apart and they couldn't afford the mortgage payments anymore. The new car they had bought with money meant for my education was repossessed 4 months later when they fell behind on payments. I didn't take any pleasure in watching their lives fall apart, but I didn't feel guilty about it either. They had made choices, and now they were living with the consequences of those choices. The only thing I felt was a strange sense of relief, like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted off my shoulders. 6 months after the Thanksgiving confrontation, I received a check in the mail for $43,000. It was from my parents, with a note that said they were repaying the money they had taken from my education fund. They didn't apologize, and they didn't ask for forgiveness. They just paid back what they owed, probably because their lawyer had told them it was the only way to avoid criminal charges for theft of inheritance funds. 2 years later, I still work at Quantum Tech Solutions, but now I have my own office with a window and a salary that lets me live comfortably without worrying about every expense. I used the inheritance money they returned to pay off my student loans and put a down payment on a condo in Lincoln Park. It's not fancy, but it has 2 bedrooms and a view of the lake, and every morning when I wake up there, I remember that I earned this life twice, once by working for it and once by fighting for it. My parents and I haven't spoken since that Thanksgiving dinner. They sent a Christmas card last year with no note inside, just their signatures, and I sent one back the same way. We're polite strangers now, connected by blood but not by love or respect or shared values. Maybe that's sad, but it's also honest in a way our relationship never was before. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had never found those letters in my grandmother's attic. Would I have spent the rest of my life feeling guilty for succeeding? Would I have kept trying to win approval from people who had been sabotaging me from the beginning? Would I have ever understood that the problem wasn't my ambition or my ingratitude, but their jealousy and their greed? The truth has a weight to it that changes everything it touches. Once you know how much someone was willing to take from you, once you understand how far they were willing to go to keep you small, you can never go back to pretending the relationship was something it wasn't. Some people deserve forgiveness, and some people deserve exactly what they get. The trick is learning to tell the difference. In the end, they didn't disown me at my graduation. They revealed who they really were, and I finally had the information I needed to respond appropriately. Sometimes the best revenge is just making sure everyone knows the truth.